Right. Welcome back. Let's go ahead and get started. We have finally made our way through the incredibly long month that is January. So happy February, and I hope that things are going well for you over the winter term so far. As a quick recap, we spent some time last class starting our discussion regarding culture in small group communication. We took some time to discuss the small group assessment, which is your next writing assignment for the class. We also took some time to understand culture in small group settings, some of the defining elements of culture, and some of the ways that we can use those defining elements to better engage in different groups. As a quick reminder, the small group assessment is an activity that's asking you to think about some of the group assignments that we've been doing in class, right? So we've done a number of them. We'll be doing another one today. That'll be an example that you can draw from in developing your small group assessment. That'll be coming up and due on the 19th. So I encourage you to look back through that prompt and begin thinking through ideas if you haven't already done so. Last class, we started to define culture, right? We care about culture for a lot of reasons, but in the context of a class like this one, right, our ability to understand the ways that cultures speak differently, but also the ways that cultures understand communication, the verbal and nonverbal signals that we use and engage with one another differently is a crucial element for us to work effectively in different group settings. Talked about the idea that beliefs, attitudes, values, and traditions are shared in a cultural setting, and the psychological element, the way that we think about and understand how issues play out, is a factor that's influenced by culture, right? You might think, for instance, about how a variety of indigenous populations use narratives and storytelling, including stories about the creation of the world and individuals on it, that help to shape an understanding of experience. We also know, right, that small groups not only have individuals from different cultures who are members of that group, but that small groups themselves create culture. In other words, if we want to understand how to work effectively in groups, we can understand how we're able to create a sense of culture among people in the group that allows people to work together effectively. So for today, We'll be talking about some of the ways that we can better understand culture in small group communication. We'll also be talking about key guiding theory about managing and dealing with uncertainty. We'll also be exploring some of the ways that culture can be measured and defined on different terms. So to get us started, again, culture is both something that people bring into groups, but groups themselves bring culture and add culture to groups via their participation and involvement in them, right? The beginning of the term, a lot of you brought up some of the challenges of engaging in small groups. For example, we find that there are people in groups who just don't gel or connect with each other, maybe people who don't communicate as actively with each other, right? It behooves us to develop a good group culture because that allows us to not only feel more trusting with each other, but also to more effectively accomplish tasks and do more than we would be able to do when compared to if we were on our own, right? If we were working in a study group, maybe for a challenging course and preparing for exams, you not only have the chance to become better at studying and have accountability, you might start to really enjoy those meetings because you've developed a new set of friends and a sense of community via the people that you were working with. So developing a sense of culture in groups is important for the effectiveness of groups and our own well-being. One thing to think about here, if we think back to the steps that people make as they become a part of a small group, is to think about those early initiation stages, right? What does it take for somebody to go from maybe interested and just starting out to being fully respected and understood as a member of the group? We can think about that in terms of rights or hazing, right? And this kind of runs a couple of extremes. On one end, right, we have a lot of colleges and universities that offer Greek life, fraternities, and sororities, right? And in Greek life, sometimes in order for somebody to become a member of a fraternity or sorority, new members have to go through some type of hazing. It could be practical jokes, it could be doing something that's funny, but there have been instances in which hazing rituals have literally cost lives or put people in the hospital, right? Sometimes things get out of hand. You have a fraternity or sorority that asks people to drink an incredibly unhealthy amount of alcohol, right? Or to do a behavior that's incredibly risky or dangerous. So that's the negative end, right? On the positive end, we can think about the rights of a new member as perhaps having a training, right? Or having the opportunity to participate in some type of exercise or activity or mentoring that involves a new member. For many of you coming into EOU, you were probably involved in a new student orientation activity, right? Or you might have taken the uni class. That's an opportunity to become acclimated to EOU and the college experience. So at its best, right, rights are an opportunity for new members to become included, to be fully participating in the group, and to do the things that are needed to be considered a full member of that group, right? And there's a challenge, there's a tension that comes in new members joining and fully participating in groups. Sometimes we have older members of a group who went through a lot of challenges and issues, and they believe that newer members of the group need to go through the same set of challenges that they did because they went through it themselves, and the new group needs to go through that too. For example, maybe there is an incredibly difficult test that you have to take to become a new member that they had to take that you need to take, right? Or maybe you're expected to run a mile in a very short period of time because that's what they had to do. An alternative approach is for older members to say, hey, we had to go through this, and we want to make it easier or more inclusive to new members of the group, so we're not going to require this. So sometimes there's a tension there between what older members of the group had to do and what newer members could do as they're joining and becoming a member of a particular group. Another key idea here is the idea of being a keeper of the flame, right? If you're involved in a club or activity here on campus, you're here as a student, but once you graduate, you're not going to be able to participate in that club or activity in the same way. Maybe you come back as a coach, or maybe you come back to offer some support as an alum, but you're not going to be able to be involved as a participant in that group in the capacity that you were before. As a result of that, right, we put a lot of emphasis on groups remaining strong through new blood, through new membership, through new participation, and the idea of keeping the flame, passing the torch down to the newest generation who will be able to keep that club going and keep that club working the way that it should be. I'll give you kind of a funny example. When I was in high school, what did I do over lunch? Well, some of my friends, I liked to play Super Smash Bros. It was a lot of fun. I made Ness, but I played a little bit of Falco and Marth. And it was just a fun activity that we did in a small group every day after school. The person running that club, though, was a senior. He was graduating, and he was trying to think of a way to pass things down to new members. And he decided the best way to do that was to have a competition, have people actually play the game in a tournament style to determine who would lead the team and lead that group the next year. So that was a whole lot of fun. And I enjoyed getting to lead that group the next couple of years after that. So that can be a way that things are passed down to members of the group, is helping them to learn the ropes, to really fully become new members, to feel included, and giving them the resources they need to succeed, knowing that people are going to come and go. So we'll be talking later in the term and looking at a lot of examples of the problem of groupthink, right? The idea that individuals in a group setting are likely to self-censor, to not share their full opinions, to not double check or second guess things out of a concern that they don't want to rock the boat or they don't want to disrupt the momentum that the group is going with, right? And that can be a big problem because it can mean that groups are not thinking things through the way that they should be and leads to a lot of bad results, whether it be foreign policy failures, whether it be advertising and PR failures, and so forth. So we'll talk about that more. But one challenge that tends to come up in group settings is the idea that we've tried this before and it didn't work. If you're a new member of a group, there's a good chance that you're coming into that group with a lot of ideas. You're coming in as an outsider who doesn't necessarily know how a group does things, and you're maybe expressing a lot of thoughts on things that could be happening differently. For example, maybe you're part of a club and you start to realize that there's a lot of people who have difficulty making it to that club because of the weather and people are traveling and so forth. And you say, hey, sometimes if people are having trouble with the weather, what if we switched and had people meet over Zoom? And then perhaps the leader of the group says, oh no, we can't do that. We tried that before. We tried to host a Zoom meeting and like nobody showed up and it was awful, right? Perhaps that experience has shaped the way the group approaches problems and issues. That can be good in terms of institutional memory and history, but on the other end, perhaps it's time to really seriously consider having a remote meeting again, maybe with different circumstances or rules. So on the one end, we don't want to toss out new ideas, but on the other, we do want to respect the history of the group and the way that they've approached perhaps similar ideas in the past that new members might not be familiar with. And lastly, as mentioned, right, cultures start to develop rituals, patterns, and behavior. They start to do things on a consistent basis as they become people in a group together. Perhaps it's a warm-up or chant or activity you do together. Perhaps it's how you use the van or the car ride on the way of competition. Perhaps it's how members of the group take a little bit of time to casually chat before they start studying together. Regardless of the context, we oftentimes start to develop a set of behaviors and things that we do as a part of the group, some of which can be passed down from older members to new ones. Again, I was in speech and debate. We like to do vocal warm-ups, and we like to have seniors who would teach the vocal warm-ups to the younger members of the team so that it kept alive. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the ways that we can explore and think about culture. One of them that I alluded to last class is a spectrum that runs from more individualistic to more collectivist culture. Right? So this map helps us to diagram a measurement of different cultures. The darker the color is, the more a culture is individualistic. The lighter the color, the more collectivist the culture tends to be. As you notice here, a lot of more individualistic cultures are those such as Australia, the United States, and Canada, whereas more collectivist cultures tend to be those located in South America, Africa, and Asia, right? In individualistic cultures, there is a greater emphasis on freedom and independence of the group members, right? The idea being that you as a person in the group are oftentimes somebody that's negotiating the interests and needs of other people with your own needs, right? So maybe you're involved in a group and Not only are you interested in working on a successful project, but you also want to stand out and show that you're doing such a great job, and maybe your boss is going to notice you and give you a promotion, right? So in that context, we're more likely to default to doing something independently, perhaps moving away from the group and working on our own projects and so forth, right? One way we can think about this is a lot of jobs that have moved to remote work and moved to, despite being a part of the team, you having more independent opportunity to complete a task, right? In a more collectivist culture, again, these are cultures that tend to have higher population density, which adds context to it. There tends to be a greater value on harmony in the group, the ability of the group members to work together in a collaborative way with one another, to get along, and to try to avoid conflict and uncomfortable situations, right? Collectivist cultures might be more likely, if there's a conflict or issue, to move on, to pretend that it didn't happen, to be more likely to cede to an authority figure, and so forth, right? There's an emphasis on trying to keep the peace in these types of settings. One example that I like to highlight are contrasts in advertising that I think do a good job of highlighting these differences too. One example I like to give is there's a company that produces golf clubs, right? And advertises those golf clubs in more individualistic cultures through particular imagery. They'll include somebody, right, who is, doing a really good drive and swinging the drive down the fairway, right? It looks like it's this person who hit a really great shot, right? Or maybe it's got a close up of them trying to sink a really difficult putt, right? It's focused on the person doing well at the game. And that's how they sell the golf clubs in more individualistic cultures. Whereas in more collectivist cultures, there tends to be a group of people, perhaps they are kind of surrounding the green and they're putting together and they're happy, they're cheering each other on. So how things are advertised tends to differ across cultures too, in terms of the values and beliefs that members of that culture might see as really important. In more individualistic cultures, power is seen as internal, right? An internal locus of control refers to the idea that you have control over your destiny, over your decision-making, that you have the ability to move things to fit what you want to achieve. And in more collectivist cultures, power is seen as outside of you, right? It's delegated to other people, it's delegated to authority figures. Your slice of the pie, your ability to manipulate or change events in your favor is a lot smaller. So how power is perceived in groups looks really different across these different measurements too. So we've talked a little bit about norms and rules. We talked about some of those details last week, but it's also important to recognize these translate into cultures too, right? So on the one end, we have what are known as explicit rule cultures. These are cultures in which the rules are written, they're understood, and they're communicated. It should come as no surprise that more explicit rule cultures also tend to be lower context cultures. If you think back, a low context culture is generally a culture where people say what they mean. There's less nonverbal communication conveying meaning. It's a lot more direct and translatable one-to-one. So in explicit rule cultures, you might be a part of a club and they might have a handbook, right? Or perhaps you and your roommates have a whiteboard or something taped on a refrigerator door that lists all of the rules and expectations of how the roommates are supposed to behave, manage daily tasks, tidying, and so forth. In a more implicit rule culture, similarly to higher context culture, there's a greater emphasis on nonverbal communication, right? People are using things such as cues, trends, patterns, and so on to develop a sense of how people should behave, right? We can think back to some of the examples you all gave last class, right? We had folks like Jade who brought up the way that depending on the club that you're a part of, there's just a norm or expectation that you're going to dress appropriately and bring the proper gear to do something like rafting or to do mountain climbing or to do another activity, right? Your ability to prepare is developed through your participation. Even if wearing the right gear, bringing the right things to the meeting is not something that's written in the rule book, it emerges as an expectation. You violate that, people are like, what the heck are you doing here? Why are you wearing shorts and a t-shirt and where's your equipment? All right, so those of you who have taken interpersonal communication with me are probably pretty familiar with this one. But I do want to refresh on this for those of you who have taken it and introduce this idea for those who haven't. How many people are familiar with the idea of uncertainty reduction theory? Okay, so a few of you, as expected. So URT is useful in group settings. This theory, by the way, is a really good option if you want to pursue it and include it in your small group assessment. I think it's a good choice to help explain some of the things going on in the activities you've been involved in, right? The key idea of URT is the idea that we experience uncertainty in our communication and in our relationships with other people, right? We can think about an easy example of this being the idea of stranger danger. As young children, we're taught, don't talk to strangers, right? Don't talk to or get to know people that aren't safe, that you don't know, right? And we're taught this as a way of keeping ourselves okay, right? We don't want to get to know and talk to somebody that could be dangerous. In that same light, right, URT is suggesting that we experience anxiety and uncertainty about other people, including in group settings. And how do we reduce that uncertainty? Well, we use communication as a means of achieving that end. So URT is axiomatic. To break that down, it means that uncertainty reduction theory has axioms or laws that help to explain the ways that that theory plays out, including in group settings, including in ways that connect to our understanding of culture. One of the first ones is really straightforward. When we start out as a participant and member of a group, we experience a lot of uncertainty, right? Perhaps it's the first day of a class, you don't know anybody in the class, and you get placed into a small group to get to know each other and complete an assignment. What's one of the first things you do? Well, you exchange each other's names, you share some basic information about yourself, like what your major is, what year in school you are, where you're from, right? And you're using that to address that immediate uncertainty. Who the heck am I talking to? Where are they coming from? Providing that basic information is a way of addressing that immediate uncertainty that we encounter around other people. Secondarily, the more we communicate non-verbally, the less uncertainty that we have about other people, right? This is important because nonverbal communication is a huge part of how we communicate. It's our volume, it's our tone of voice, it's our use of physicality, it's our use of facial expression, it's how we say something and what that reveals to us that becomes really important. That's why we find face-to-face communication so meaningful, because it gives us an opportunity to really connect to other people, to learn and get to know them better, and so forth. When we communicate online, there's a lot of barriers, there's a lot of challenges, right? For example, maybe we're talking to somebody online through Discord and it's a user on the internet that we've never met. Are they who they say they are? Can we trust them? Are they somebody that catfishes, right? Or presents a false version of themselves online that isn't who they are in real life? It's difficult to confirm that information online. And also there's a lot of ambiguity that happens online, right? Somebody texts and says, I'm doing okay. And you think to yourself, are they really doing okay? Or do they need some help? Do they want somebody to talk to? That would be easier to understand face-to-face. So nonverbal communication allows us to better understand, to relate to some people, to pick up on their patterns of behavior and communication, to put a face to a name, to engage a bit more in how they communicate too. So that helps to understand that element. We seek out more information when we have high uncertainty. Again, what's one of the first things we do if we don't know somebody? We ask their names, right? Getting that basic information helps us to get our guard down a bit. We might start by asking questions about that person to get to know some of the greater details about them. If you have taken either interpersonal or communication theory, you might be familiar with social penetration theory. That's the idea that we're like onions, right? We have the outer layers, the basic information, but as we get to know and become closer to other people, we start to move in and reveal our values, our beliefs, our hopes, our dreams, things that are a lot more personal to us that become disclosed over time. Intimacy is lower when uncertainty is higher, right? That's a pretty straightforward one. Intimacy, of course, referring to emotional and psychological closeness, may or may not be romantic, right? But when we become less sure of or confident in people, we tend to withdraw. For example, perhaps you're dating somebody and you discover one day that they have a secret, right? They have a child and you never knew that they had a child. And they never talked about it. It never came up. And suddenly you discover that they have a 3-year-old and you think to yourself, wow, I thought I knew this person, but I guess I don't. This is a huge detail that they never shared with me, right? Which might cause you to increase your uncertainty, withdraw, and decrease your intimacy toward that person. So there's this idea of reciprocity, and you can think about reciprocity like a seesaw, right? A lot of times our early conversations with people can be really awkward because it feels very one-to-one and staccato. How are you doing? Oh, I'm good. How are you? Oh, I'm fine. How's the weather? Oh, it's okay. Like it feels very stilted, it feels very scripted. And early on, our conversations tend to play out that way, where there's an even distribution of who's talking and who's listening. But over time, as we become more confident and closer to other people, our conversations can become more lopsided, right? For example, maybe you have a close friend and that close friend just had a job interview and they want to vent and talk about the whole job interview. They want to talk about the whole process and you're there to listen and to support them. You wouldn't necessarily do that with somebody you first met, but you would do that with somebody with whom you trust and are willing to share that story to. So as we become more confident and close to other people, right, we decrease our uncertainty. This is also connected to culture insofar as the differences that we experience with each other are also likely to increase the uncertainty that we feel toward one another, right? As we talked about last class, we tend to gravitate toward stereotypes and prejudice when we don't have as much information to fill in the gaps to understand people who are culturally different than us, right? So generally speaking, when we are interacting with people that seem to be very different and we don't have that framework, we likely experience more uncertainty. How should I act? How should I behave around this person? What's considered appropriate or inappropriate, right? Oftentimes there's a lot of training that things such as national and international leaders do to make sure that their use of verbal and nonverbal communication is appropriate. Depending on the culture, perhaps it's inappropriate to touch somebody or tap somebody on the shoulder, right? That is something a lot of United States world leaders have had to learn whenever they have worked with the German chancellor, right? So those are examples here of how we are careful about managing differences. And more uncertainty means that we like other people less. The opposite is also true, right? We tend to like people more the more we get to know them. So there's a reason that a lot of couples meet through work, right? They get married and all of that happens because they've spent an extended period of time together at work. It's kind of a Stockholm syndrome, but it's the idea that over time, if we spend a lot of time with people, what happens? We start to get to know them better. We see them regularly. We feel like we can predict what they'll do. Maybe you have a coworker and every day, 9:15 in the morning without fail, they walk down the hall with their coffee and ask you how your day is going, right? And then when you ask how their day is going, they say, oh, I'm living the dream. And they say that every single day, right? So that might be an example of how you feel more confident, you like the person more because they're predictable and they're a part of your routine, right? You tend to feel some comfort in that happens over time. So this helps us to kind of unpack how we form closer connections with other people, including those of different cultures, through reducing uncertainty via communication, right? That means in a lot of group settings, it's a good idea to leading a group or to participating in a group to do casual activities. Maybe you hang out and get coffee, right? Or maybe you go down to Side A or the local as a way of casually getting to know each other if you're working together on something. So we have a number of measures of cultural difference, right? And these different measures will be useful for you as you think about today's group activity, but also useful as you're thinking about your small group assessment. And these help us to understand some of the ways that cultures might communicate and engage differently in groups. And these were, as last class we discussed, developed by Stuart Hall, who really sparked cultural studies and how we can compare the ways that different cultures communicate with one another. So one of the key ideas here is about culture and time, right? And there are a few different ways that we can think about this as it pertains to group meetings and participation. So one of the ways that we can think about this monochromatic versus polychromatic time orientation, right? In a monochromatic time orientation, that means the culture group is very concerned with making strict times. For example, if you got sent to the principal's office, right, you have to meet with the principal at 1 o'clock, you're probably going to show up at 1 o'clock. That's very monochromatic. But if you're a member of like a group of friends and you decide that you're going to hang out and like get there maybe at about 1, you could have people who could be coming as late as like 2:30. So how casual or how rigid a culture might be with its use of time is important. For example, if you travel internationally, you'll notice a lot of differences. Or even if you travel to different towns, right, the approach to time looks very different. For example, right, you go somewhere like the UK or you go somewhere like New York City, and what happens? Well, you see people who are walking very quickly. You see people who are checking their watches, right? There was a British person that was behind me when I was in the TSA line for a flight, and they like kept repeatedly tapping their watch on their wrist and expressing a lot of frustration about making their flight on time. It's a very good example of monochromatic. Or you go somewhere like California, and people tend to drive a lot more quickly. There's a greater focus on getting where you need to go by a certain point of time, right? Notice, moving to a more rural town, there's more polychromatic, right? It's a little bit less rigid. I live on the other side of the tracks, right? And what happens? Well, I'm driving back from work and you get the train, right? And sometimes the train goes, other times the train just is completely stopped. So you go up and you have to go around the ramp, right? So orientation toward time can look different. It can also be a difference between short-term time orientation versus long-term time orientation. In more short-term time orientation, there's focusing on pleasure in the moment, what's good right now, right? Enjoying, seizing the day, seizing the moment. Whereas cultures with longer-term time orientation tend to be people who plan things out, who schedule, who wrap, who have a bit more order. Right? So one example of this is the EOU recently implemented a policy where if you go to register for classes, right, you get to see your courses 4 terms in advance. And we did that to try to help people with prep and long-term planning. An example of how long-term time orientation can be utilized to impact the culture and the way the culture communicates. Another important factor here is thinking about gender, right? And so what I have here is pulled from a map of the ways that gender is practiced differently across a variety of different countries, cultures, and contexts, right? Each one of these corresponds to a very different practice of gender, including in a lot of Indigenous and First Nation communities, right? And what I think it's important to put into context is the idea that depending on the culture that you're a member of, what it means to identify with or express gender looks very different. We can think about this in terms of clothing. We can think about this in terms of gender distribution of labor, of tasks, of responsibilities, and behavior that somebody might be doing. How strong are particular norms or expectations surrounding a gender, and how, whether explicitly or implicitly, do they translate into how members of a group might behave with one another, right? Another thing, as we've talked about, is the role of directness. So some cultures tend to offer very direct, explicit communication. They say what they mean. Other cultures tend to be a lot more implicit. They imply or suggest something. Perhaps rather than saying no, they say maybe, or they sound a little bit more hesitant. So that's another difference for us to consider. Materialism also plays a role, right? Some cultures are more materialistic. That is, they put a greater value or emphasis on things, on objects, where other cultures might tend to place more emphasis on people, right? So one example of this is if you think about the role of advertising, right? If we have couples, algorithms and all of that are more likely to give them advertisements about engagement rings, right? That would be an example of a more materialist focus that might not be quite as persuasive or effective in other countries and situations. So one of the things to think about here is how the values and elements of culture might translate into communication and messaging designed for those cultures. And then lastly, as I've alluded to a little bit last class, there's the role of power distance, right? So power distance runs a spectrum. On the one end, we have high power distance. And in those contexts, which tend to be more collectivist cultures, there are people who are less likely to disagree openly with one another. In high power distance, you're more likely to have people who are ceding to authority, right? Perhaps you have a coach or a leader in your group, and you don't mess with them, right? You don't talk back to them. Perhaps you're in a family situation where you're not supposed to talk back to a member of that family. That's higher power distance, where you're more likely to listen to authority, you're less likely to communicate. Whereas in lower power distance, there's an emphasis on speaking openly, expressing your disagreements with other people in the group, and the leader of the group creating a space for those disagreements to be expressed and brought to the table. Oftentimes, leaders are more willing to welcome those ideas and welcome pushback in those types of settings. So what I want us to do now is to pursue a group activity that'll ask us to apply and utilize some of these ideas that we've been talking about so far. So we have Luis here, who would like to join a hiking club on campus. This club has 6 members, but he's worried about being able to fit into this new group. So what I'd like your group to discuss first is how uncertainty reduction theory could impact his communication within the group. The types of communication he would do in this group, given his high levels of uncertainty, could be the behavior, types of questions he asks, the things that he chooses to act on in that group. And then second of all, how does uncertainty reduction theory explain how people in the group would communicate with him? And then lastly, I'd like your group to pick one of the 5 measurements of cultural difference that we've talked about, and think about how this could impact the hiking group and the ways that it communicates. So I'm going to do a quick head count with that. Okay, so let's do a group of 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Let's do a group of 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Let's do a group of 1, 2, 3, and 4, and 5. So take some time to move over to your group. Have one person who will write or type for your group for attendance for the day. I'll give you about 10 minutes or so to work on this prompt, and then we'll talk about this one together.
I don't have any paper, so yeah, I don't know if it's a good deal. Theory I know that when watching other people, right? Like body talk. Yeah, first of all, observation. See what people Number 2, yeah, go ahead. So how does uncertainty reduction theory explain the way other members of the hiking group will communicate with this? Probably more open so that we can understand. Yeah, okay. So make sure they're including him, making sure he understands what's going on and is involved with.
they can like get to know him also. I'm still my favorite
Times, probably Draculus. Draculus.
Yeah. How did you just think
Yeah, that's not really, I mean, they're like not gonna be there.
Yeah.
Everything else is pretty honest.
Yeah, you know what happened?
So, difference be more correctness, like what we discussed in few times, like hopefully more direct.
Regulations of something like bring in how we pay it, like snap, I don't know,
I don't even know if it's so bad that it's like I really need my notes. I'll just take one computer and do it.
Even though I have like 3 years.
I could like my math teacher's really into writing stuff out. So like I got really good handwriting for her, but it takes 5 times as long.
Give your group about 4 or 5 more minutes. Might take some time to think about some additional examples here of the type of communication that would be used.
Make sure
they're all.
make sure you have this stuff. Make sure you know what we
Yeah. And still they start out, maybe like the type of talk is that's okay and not like some humor and stuff they go like yeah, that'd be part of 3 bread scroll. Like 2 or 3 yeah. I'll throw that. You're not going to listen to the people.
How does this? How does this go there? So one person, the rest of the group on. One
I thought I would. Yeah.
And that's good. I didn't know we moved on. Oh, I'll also say like make sure like say oh the meeting starts at or the meeting starts at 1 that people don't show up or something.
Yeah.
take a couple more minutes to finish up.
Right. So regarding what's expected of him and what the group overall is like. Yeah, love the rest of this ceremony. Like, it's what button back here. So sometimes it's bored, man. I'm like, it's on my fingers.
Yeah, thank you.
Sounds like groups are about done here. So let's take some time to hear from each group and some of the things that they discussed in response to these questions. So let's start with this group here. What did you all say in addressing the scenario?
All right, so first off, question one, we basically said observe the group, you know, kind of see what the norms are, you know, the implicit ones, and then the explicit ones, you know, ask like, hey, like, do you show up 15 minutes early? You know, what kind of gear am I going to need to bring? You know, just what is expected of me as a group member, that kind of thing. And then also, you know, with the implicit norms, kind of be like, hey, what kind of jokes are okay to make? And like, you know, how seriously do we take this? Like, is this a casual fun thing, or are we all like super serious hikers? You know, kind of view that. And next one, you basically make sure, you know, how does it serve it? Basically just ensure he knows what's going on, communicate with them, basically be direct.
Sure.
You know, I feel like that's the big one here, because time, gender, power distance, and materialism just aren't going to come much into play in this.
Okay.
Just because, I mean, it's a little club with 6 members, like that kind of stuff just isn't going to affect it that much. But directness and communication will.
Yeah.
So just ensuring like he knows what to do as a group member, and kind of what is expected of him as a group member is essentially the goal.
Yeah. So really, I appreciate your response here. I think thinking about some of these measures of difference, right? The size of the group being pretty small and the way that people are going to work closely with each other. You know, the directness with which they communicate is good. I also really appreciated your group points here about how seriously the group takes it, right? That's going to shape the norms and behavior. Are you all like really intense? Do you bring in backpacking gear every day? Or do you wear sneakers? Do you just kind of go out and take a little walk at Mira every now and then? Like, what do you do? So understanding those norms as starting out in more of an observer role, I think can be a useful strategy. But over here with this group.
So this one says significantly lower into high levels of activity. He's going to be important to ask questions because he's not sure. He's not his experience, so he's going to be learning more about the right gear, not knowing the specific driving terms. Due to the theory, the other people, the older members, there's going to be differences because the internet, so it's going to increase uncertainty, and so they might be less interactive, joking, and casual. And then for our time measurements, we chose time. There's going to be a lot of time related to hiking. We're going to know everybody. So he's going to have to balance, is it mathematical? Because he's going to have to show up on time, make sure everyone's prepared, like what specific trails and what level of devotion.
Yeah. So figuring out those details, like about the intensity of the group, it's not only helpful to like be appropriate, like if you are overly intense compared to the group or you're too lax compared to the group, that can be a problem. It can also be good for a potential new member to figure out if it's a fit. Maybe Luis is a casual hiker and the intensity of the group is just not quite what he's looking for, right? So on both ends, we do it as an opportunity to figure out if this fits in our lives and what we're looking for out of the group. And then lastly, let's hear from the group back here.
So for the first one, we said that you might ask more questions, find common ground, and there will be more non-verbal communication, as well as just do a lot of observing. And then the second one, we said there would be communicating directly to Liz instead of the other group members, since they already know each other. We can spend more time just getting to know them. Sure. And then the third one, we said the difference in time could cause conflict with scheduling the hike, and we could be left behind so we would know what the time is.
Yeah, so time orientation matters both in terms of potential meetings, but it also matters in like the hike itself, right? How do we keep pace? How do we use time with each other? Do we stop for other people, right? Or do people just keep going in a more independent way? That might also be related to things such as if it's a more individualistic or collectivist type of group, right? Do we wait for other people or do people just keep going and you just got to keep up, right? So some of those differences are things we can see translate here too. I wanted to do this activity to help us not only to think about new membership, but also to think about how we've been talking about culture and some of the ways that culture is impacting the norms and behavior of groups. There are a lot of things that might play out as we're participating in a group that we might not think of immediately, such as the ways that time is managed, the intensity of the group, the way that groups come into meetings with different roles and expectations that help new members to feel more included over time. So we talked a little bit about culture and how culture can impact group behavior, including the use of uncertainty reduction theory and some of the measurements of cultural difference to help us better understand group behavior. On Friday, we'll be talking about group membership and culture in international contexts. So we'll be exploring these ideas a little bit more. Please pass forward or email me your group activity with your group members' names on it. Have a great rest of your afternoon, and I will see you again for Friday's class. Thank you.